All right, let's jump right into one of the most pivotal points in military history, the birth of the Roman Republic. Now, we're not just talking about a simple regime change, are we? This was a total upheaval, one that set the stage for, well, an empire, one that would come to dominate Europe for centuries. And what's really fascinating is that this wasn't a smooth transition, that Roman Republic was forged in these intense conflicts. And those early struggles really did shape their military evolution in ways that I think are really surprising. So imagine this. Rome's just kicked out their last king. Tarquinius Superbus out of there. They're ready for a fresh start, right? So in come the consuls. 2 leaders elected annually, each with veto power over the other. Talk about checks and balances. Why do you think they were so fixated on this idea of dividing power, especially when it came to, something as critical as the military? Well, I think it's pretty clear. They'd just thrown off the rule of king, one they saw as a tyrant. So there was this real fear of concentrating too much power, even in one person, even for a short time. It's almost like they hardwired this deep fear of tyranny right into their system. Yeah, it's like, okay, we'll have 2 generals, sure, but neither of you can go full-on Caesar just yet. Right? It just makes me think, how did that impact the way they actually waged war, especially those early years? Oh, absolutely. You can see how this system would create both opportunities but also some real challenges. On the battlefield, having 2 leaders, well, it could lead to disagreements, delays, even completely clashing strategies, which could be disastrous, right? But on the flip side, it also prevented any one ambitious general from, making rash decisions that could risk the entire campaign. It's like a balancing act between being cautious and being decisive. And speaking of power, they also have this fascinating figure, right? The dictator. How did they fit this, kind of contradictory rule into a republic? I mean, it's like saying, okay, we get rid of the king, but we might just need another one sometimes. Temporarily, of course. Exactly. It was a measure for extreme situations. The Senate could basically give absolute power to one person, but only for a very limited time. They used it when swift action was absolutely necessary, like if they faced a huge military threat. A calculated risk, you could say. And for those listening who are really into military history, the dictator wasn't just a figurehead, right? He had these enforcers, the lictors, carrying those, kind of scary bundles of rods with an axe sticking out, the fasces. Pretty strong image. What kind of message do you think that's? You're spot on. Those fasces were a symbol of the dictator's authority to punish, even execute. It's interesting, isn't it, how the word fascist comes from that very symbol. It's fascinating to see how a term, initially tied to a specific role in a republic, could later become associated with some of the most authoritarian regimes in history. Makes me think about how symbols can evolve, how it's used and how it's seen. That changes across time. But let's shift gears a bit. What with the Senate? They weren't just advisors anymore, right? They became a real powerhouse. Kind of like a very early prototype for modern-day legislative bodies. Absolutely. The Senate's rise is a perfect example of how these early power struggles really shaped Rome's institutions. They went from advisors to drafting and approving laws. They had control over finances and a huge influence on the military. In fact, the military powers even the US Senate has today, those roots go all the way back to Rome. That's incredible. Seeing these ancient systems still having impact, and it reminds me of Publius Valerius. He was crucial in establishing the Republic, alongside Brutus. He was so admired by America's founding fathers, they even used his name when writing the Federalist Papers. That's right, they wrote as Publius, paying tribute to Valerius and his defense of Republican ideals. Really shows how influential Roman ideas were for those shaping the early American Republic. Ideas about governance, about civic duty. So we've got consuls, a Senate that's gaining power. But then, plot twist. Enter the People's Assembly. How did that come about, and why was it so important, especially for let's call them the common folk, the plebeians, who, by the way, made up most of Rome's army? I think it really shows the plebeian strategic thinking, their willingness to, let's say, flex their collective muscle. These were the citizen soldiers, the backbone of the legions. They knew their worth, and they weren't afraid to use it to get their rights. So this wasn't just politics. This is about, will Rome survive if you alienate the people fighting your wars? Exactly. Look at the first secession of the clubs, 494 BC. Rome's at war, and boo, half the army just disappears. The plebeians, they walked out, they marched right out of the city and basically said, we'll be back when we're treated fairly. No, that's a power move. No violence, no bloodshed, just, nope, we're out of here until things change. And it worked.
It did. The ruling class had to concede, and it led to the creation of the plebeian assembly. It gave the people a voice. They could elect their own officials, the tribunes, and they could veto anything from the Senate or the consuls. A huge step toward a better balance of power. So we got consuls for leadership, a Senate making laws, and a people's assembly representing the folks who were often the soldiers on the front lines. Seems like a recipe for stability, right? Well, not quite. These institutions were meant to prevent tyranny, to give different groups a say. But the fight for power in Rome, that was far from over. The tensions between the plebeians and the patricians, those continued to simmer. And these conflicts, they played a huge role in how the Republic waged war, how it grew its influence in the centuries to come. Now that's a fantastic point, and it takes us right to our next section. We'll explore how those internal struggles actually drove Rome's expansion, how it transformed from a new republic into, a dominant military force in the ancient world. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Roman Republic. Before the break, we were talking about how the plebeian assembly really gained power, gave voice to the common soldiers, the backbone of those legions. So I'm curious, did this shift in power change how Rome approached warfare? Like, did it impact their strategies, their ambitions on the battlefield? Oh, absolutely. The plebeians, they wanted land, economic opportunity, and that really forced Rome's leaders to look outwards. Military expansion, it became a way to, keep those citizen soldiers happy, offer them the spoils of war, a chance for a better life. So it's almost like these internal pressures actually drove their expansion. It's amazing how internal politics can shape a nation's military trajectory. Exactly. And this leads us nicely to the expansion of Roman power, and of course the meaning of that iconic acronym, SPQR. We see it everywhere, right? On Roman artifacts, monuments. What did it actually mean to the Romans themselves? I'll admit, I always thought SPQR was like Rome's official name, like the United States of America. But something tells me it's not that straightforward. You're right, it's a common misunderstanding. SPQR, it stands for Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. But it was more than just a name, it was a symbol of the Republic. It represented that shared power between the Senate and the people, especially the citizen soldiers who fought so hard for their rights. So it represented this ideal of a government where power was shared, not in the hands of just one ruler. It's amazing how a symbol born out of those early power struggles could become such a powerful expression of Roman identity, especially as they expanded their influence. Exactly, it was everywhere. On their banners, coins, monuments, it represented unity, strength. It was a powerful tool, even for propaganda, a way to rally the people, to give legitimacy to their conquests. It's interesting, even later emperors, they used SPQR to connect themselves to the legacy of the Republic, even though they ruled with, let's be honest, absolute authority. Clever strategy. Speaking of strategy, let's talk about those military conquests. We know Rome built this massive empire, but it didn't happen overnight. For our military history buffs out there, what were some of those early conflicts that really shaped the Roman war machine? Well, in the beginning, Rome was mostly focused on securing its immediate surroundings. They faced constant threats from neighbors, tribes like the Etruscans, the Samnites, the Gauls. These were brutal wars, often fought for survival. They forced the Romans to adapt, to innovate. I can imagine those early battles were like a crucible. They forged the Roman legions into this, legendary fighting force we read about. What made the legions so effective? What the key elements? The legions, they were disciplined, organized. Unlike many city-states with their citizen armies, the legion was professional, trained, equipped for long campaigns. They were masters of siege warfare, building fortifications, assaulting enemy strongholds, and, I think most importantly, adaptable, able to fight in all sorts of terrains against all kinds of opponents. It's fascinating how these conflicts shaped their tactics, their organizations, so that they were constantly learning, refining their methods. And that's what made them so formidable. They weren't afraid to learn from their enemies, to adopt new techniques. But those early conflicts, those were just the start, the real turning point. The moment Rome shifted from regional power to a global player, it came with the Punic Wars against Carthage. The Punic Wars. That's where we get those epic stories. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general crossing the Alps with elephants, talk about a logistical challenge and some serious audacity. Hannibal's invasion of Italy was a brilliant military move. He outmaneuvered the Romans time and time again, inflicted some devastating losses. For a while it looked like Rome was finished. But they pulled through, didn't they? What allowed them to withstand such a powerful enemy? Did those wars force them to change their military thinking? It was a brutal lesson, but they learned from it. They realized how important naval power was, something they'd neglected before. They adapted their tactics to counter Hannibal. And, most importantly, they were resilient, determined to never give up even when facing those seemingly impossible odds.
Sounds like those wars were a defining moment. They faced a truly formidable opponent, learned from their losses, and came out stronger.
Absolutely. Those Punic Wars transformed the Roman military from a land-based force to a power that could control the seas. They honed their strategic thinking, developed an incredible ability to adapt, to overcome adversity.
And after Carthage, where did their ambitions lead them? Did they continue to expand their empire?
So, after they defeated Carthage, Rome turned their attention east. They clashed with the Hellenistic Kingdoms, the successors to Alexander the Great's massive empire. And those were sophisticated adversaries, rich military traditions of their own. They posed a whole new set of challenges for the legions.
I imagine it wasn't just brute force anymore, right? They're going up against enemy who were just as skilled as strategic. How did the Romans adapt to these new battlefields, these new types of enemies?
They had to, right? These Eastern campaigns forced them to refine their tactics even further, their organizational structures. They came up against new ways of fighting, like the Macedonian phalanx formations, the cavalry-heavy armies of the Seleucid Empire, and they had to adapt to the terrain, from the mountains of Greece to the plains of the Near East.
For our military history fans, were there any battles or campaigns from this period that really stand out? In terms of, shapy Roman military thinking, showing their ability to adapt?
Oh, absolutely. The Battle of Cynoscephalae, 197 DC. Against the Macedonians, that's a great example. The Romans, they initially struggled against that Macedonian phalanx. It was formidable, but they used the terrain to their advantage. And the flexibility of the legions, well, they outmaneuvered their enemy and ultimate won. It really showed how adaptable the Roman legions were.
Yeah.
How they could overcome even the most, renowned military formations of the time.
It's incredible how they took those lessons and incorporated them into their doctrine. It speaks to their pragmatism, their willingness to learn, even from their opponents.
Exactly. And their victory over those Hellenistic kingdoms, it cemented Rome's position as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. By the 1st century BC, their empire stretched from Spain all the way to Egypt, a vast mix of cultures and people.
It's an amazing feat of military and political expansion. But as we've talked about, it wasn't just about brute force. They were also masters of diplomacy, right? Bringing conquered people into their system, giving them some autonomy, even offering citizenship in exchange for loyalty.
Their ability to integrate those conquered people, that was key to their stability. It created this complex web of alliances, strengthened their rule, turned the empire into something much more durable than just, a collection of conquered lands.
It sounds like they understood that true power isn't just about winning battles. It's about building a system that lasts,
Right.
when they can incorporate different peoples, different cultures.
Exactly. The Roman Republic, its journey from a city-state to a vast empire, it shows us their military strength, their political skills, their ability to adapt, to integrate. It's a story of constant struggle, both within and outside their borders. And it's a reminder of how we, as humans, can shape our own destiny through conflict, compromise, and this unwavering will to succeed.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Roman Republic, what's the takeaway for our military history buffs? What can we learn from the rise of this ancient superpower?
I think Rome reminds us that military power is never static. It's always evolving, adapting to new threats, new opponents. Their success came from learning from their mistakes, incorporating new ideas, technologies, and forging a system that could harness the energy of, a very diverse population. These are lessons that are still relevant, even today, as the nature of warfare, it keeps changing faster and faster.
That's a great point. Well, on that note, we come to the end of our deep dive into the Roman Republic. We hope you found this exploration of military history as engaging as we did. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those strategic minds working.